the chair of our next panel, Richard Fizzy. Richard is an inquiry chair at the Competition and Markets Authority and senior advisor at the Center on Regulation in Europe, where he researches digital policy. It was at Vodafone until 2013, having been its group policy director for 12 years, and has undertaken a variety of advisory roles since then. Richard, it's over to you now, and I'll let you introduce the other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, and good afternoon, everybody. So Laura's introduced me. My job is to chair this panel, introduce our distinguished panelists. We have Vanessa Turner. Welcome, Vanessa, who is the head of competition at BEUC, which, for those of you who don't know, speaks on behalf of consumer bodies and consumers in Europe. We have Oliver Bethel, who's I'm sure known to many of you, who is the head of competition, director of competition for Europe, and EMEA at Google. Welcome, Oliver. And we have Ewan McMillan, who is a director at the Competition and Markets Authority at the Digital Markets Unit, which I'm sure we'll just come on to discuss a bit more later. So the way we'll run this is each of the panelists will make a few opening remarks, and then we will get into some discussion in the panel, and then perhaps some questions at the end. The context here, I think, is that we've been talking about platform regulation or regulation of digital platforms for some of us for many years now, but it's actually sort of finally arrived, and we're moving from debate to action and execution and implementation. And so what we'll try and get at in this panel is a sense of what, from different perspectives, from companies, from regulators, and from the consumer's point of view, what people are focusing on, what are the priorities, what are some of the challenges they anticipate, and what are their expectations and aspirations in terms of what platform regulation as it rolls forward, both in the United Kingdom and in Europe, and perhaps elsewhere as well in the coming years. What are we likely to see? Perhaps I could start, Vanessa, and ask you if you have a few introductory comments to make.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you also to platform leaders for inviting consumer representatives to participate today. So from the consumer perspective, I think we are seeing a new regulatory paradigm emerging for platforms and digital markets, certainly in Europe, in the EU, where I work with the Digital Markets Act, the DMA, the DSA, the Digital Services Act, the Data Act, the AI Act, the Data Governance Act, and so on. And there are more, but I won't list them all. But also at national level, including in the UK. And we may see this develop in other parts of the world too, such as Australia, Asia, and maybe even the US, perhaps more likely at state than federal level, but we will see. So tech companies have brought us a lot of good things as consumers, but also some much less good things. Therefore, such regulation is essential for society and to ensure trust and consumer choice. So regulation is coming, or as Richard just said, is actually already partly here. And there may be some differences in approach, as is the case, for example, between the EU's Digital Markets Act, DMA, and the currently proposed UK equivalent. And let's see whether the DMA and other EU regulation has the kind of Brussels effect we've seen for other legislation in the digital world. But as we'll cover that particular issue shortly, I'm going to park that for now and mention what we, from the consumer perspective, see as a key issue in this new platform regulation landscape. And that is whether this new regulation can be effectively enforced in practice to realize the intended benefits for platform users, whether businesses or consumers. And to my mind, this will require a number of elements to be successful, and I'm only going to focus on three. First of all, given the information asymmetry between the regulators and the regulated, for successful enforcement, it will be necessary to ensure that the regulators have sufficient resources and the right kind of resources to do their job effectively. I think the jury is still out on this in the case of the European Commission, and possibly the CMA or DMU might be in a better position. Also, to reduce information asymmetries, I think it's going to be essential to involve third parties in the implementation and enforcement of platform regulation. And by third parties, I mean business and consumers or other civil society organisations. The EU DMA foresees this in principle, but how it will play out in practice is yet to be seen. The situation for other regulations, such as the Digital Services Act, is more complex, as enforcement is primarily in the member states rather than with the European Commission. The draft UK regime involves public consultation, from what I've seen, on CMA DMU decisions, and perhaps Ewan can explain or can expand a bit on that, what it might mean in practice. So that's my first essential point. The second one is that consumers will need to be able to effectively enforce their rights under platform regulation through collective redress or class action regimes, however you want to call it. The inequality of arms between tech companies and individual consumers makes individual actions very difficult. And the DMA, unlike EU competition law, provides for collective redress as a result of the inclusion of the DMA and, in fact, the DSA and potentially some of the other EU regulation that I mentioned earlier, and provides that can be included or is included within the Representative Actions Directive, which is due to come into force this month. That's good news for consumers because it should enable collective actions if platforms fail to comply with regulation. I think in the UK, the situation seems to be the other way around with better options under competition law currently, but let's see how that pans out. So then my final point for effective enforcement is that for this multitude of platform regulation to work well, coordination between different regulators will be essential to ensure consistency and coherence, to avoid turf wars and enforcement gaps and forum shopping. And I think that means coordination of enforcement between competition, consumer, data protection regulators and the enforcement of the various laws if they're not within the same body, but also means coordination internationally. So in a nutshell, getting the law to regulate platforms right is only step one. We must also focus on effective enforcement of the law.
Great. Thank you, Vanessa. We'll come back, I'm sure, as you say, to some of those points as we get into the discussion. Oliver.
Thanks a lot, Richard, and thanks for having me here. So I guess a couple of observations from Google on how we're thinking about these new regulations. I think that particularly when we look at comparison between the Digital Markets Act and the UK bill, I think there are some areas of similarity and some areas of difference for sure. And when we compare these pieces of legislation, I think with other new forms of competition legislation, you identified similar similarities and differences. And I think when it comes to the objectives of the legislation, it's often not that difficult to see that we're headed in the same direction. We're looking for fair processes. This is not about a particular outcome that the legislator has in mind, but there's a particular way of ensuring that there's a fair, level playing field where everyone can compete on the merits. So there's a shared goal, I think, even when you compare existing competition rules and some of the new legislation that we're seeing today. What is changing for sure is the way in which we will need to be thinking about the practical application of this legislation, the rules that are meant to get to that particular outcome, the fairer markets. The application internally will change, I think, for us at Google. So too, the ways in which we interact with regulators will have to evolve. And I think Vanessa's already nodded to a couple of ways in which we will be responsible for ensuring that that's effective. So on the internal facing part of the process, when we look at the DMA, the list of core platform services, articles 5 through 7, so too when you look at the notion of designated activity conduct requirements, what you're really setting out there is a roadmap of quite specific types of product changes, things that you expect to see manifesting within Google within the companies that are subject to the new rules. And what that is really starting to mean for us, it's been taking place for some years actually, to be quite frank with you all, is very much a shift away from a model where legal sort of sits as a check and balance at the end of a product development process, to legal needing to be, competition legal needing to be very closely intertwined with product decisions as they're being taken day to day. There's much more of an ethos now within Google to be engineering for compliance. That is an attribute you need to be considering when you're very early in the process, deciding which particular route to take when you're trying to build a new feature or innovation. So that, I think, is something that's new. Similarly, with the external facing part of our practice, you can't really hope to successfully, pragmatically, quickly come into compliance and reduce your regulatory overhead if you're not prepared to be very fast and quick and evidence-led in your discussions with agencies who are building out these new types of tools. That is very, very clear to me personally and to Google as a company. If you intend to find solutions that are practicable, that are reasonable, that are informed by how the products actually work, products that are obviously, I mean, AI is a great example of this, the speed with which some of these things are evolving absolutely requires quick and early engagement with the agency. So I think that's another feature of the new legislation and how we expect it will affect the practice. At its core, really is a desire across what is, putting to one side some of the other pieces of legislation that Vanessa nodded to. If you just focus on the 22 or so rules within the DMA, you take that together with potential designated activities within the UK, there's an awful lot of ground to cover across different product areas within the company. And the one message that I receive repeatedly and have been receiving since early 2022 is, get us the information that helps us understand what we need to do. That is what's most important to us. We are not interested in long, protracted, drawn-out litigations. We want to understand how the rules should apply. We want the people who are giving that view to have a good understanding of how we build the products and how they work. We want them to understand the tools that we have at our disposal when it comes to testing and understanding the impacts of the services that we're launching. But that really is the overriding message that I hear from people internally now, is engage, understand, and find solutions. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Oliver. Very clear. I think we'll come back to some of that as well. Ewan.
Thank you, Richard, and good afternoon to everyone, to other panelists, and the 94 people I can see that are on the call. Both Vanessa and Oliver did such a fantastic job at introducing there and made quite a lot of the same points that I was going to make. But perhaps what I'll quickly do is introduce myself and the digital markets unit, and then respond actually to, I think, the 3 framing points that Vanessa made, which I think is a really useful frame for the conversation. So I'm a director in the digital markets unit within the Competition Markets Authority. We are in the DMU in what we call shadow form, as we're waiting on legislation to put us on a statutory footing. That legislation is the Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Bill that was introduced into Parliament in April. It's moving pretty rapidly through the process, so we've had second reading already, and the committee stage will be next week when there'll be evidence sessions with parliamentarians. This is focused on competition and consumer laws. The question that I think you'd put, Richard, earlier to us was, is there a paradigm shift in regulation for platforms? And clearly that is, I think, evidently true, not only with respect to competition issues, but also things like online safety and data bills, which are also going through the UK Parliament. This bill, as Oliver said, is very similar in intent to the Digital Markets Act, and from a sort of external perspective is actually really quite similar in the approach that it's taking. There are some nuances that are differences in the approach between the 2 bills. But we are basically trying to designate particular firms, a small handful of firms, as having strategic market status in particular digital activities, where they have substantial and entrenched market power, giving them a strategic position in the UK market, and obviously equivalently the DMA in the EU market. That will then allow us to impose ex-ante behavioural constraints on those companies to open up the markets to competitors, but also where competition isn't practical, to be able to constrain behaviour in the best interests of people, businesses, and the economy. So We're going through the parliamentary process. We're a little bit behind the EU. This is a paradigm shift across the world, as we mentioned. When the UK held the G7 presidency in 2021, we kickstarted some work on coordinating with other competition authorities so that we were all comparing notes on what we were doing. And OECD took this forward alongside subsequent G7 presidencies, the Germans and the Japanese. And it's clear that there are a lot of jurisdictions thinking through this. EU, obviously, but also Australia has similar proposals. Japan, Germany at national level, and as Vanessa mentioned, in the US. It's important that we get the law right, but I think those three things that Vanessa touched on are really important. So the resources, the participative approach involving other parties, and then the coordination. And maybe if I could just very quickly run through those. Very happy, obviously, that Vanessa mentioned resources for regulators. It's great if we could have as much resources as possible. And it behooves me to mention that we are recruiting at the minute. So we have 20 positions open. So anyone on the call interested, please it's through LinkedIn. I would get my knuckles wrapped if I didn't mention that. But this, we hope, will be the first wave of recruitment of an additional uplift in resources as we expect the bill to get to Royal Assent. Then involving third parties. So the participative approach is something that right through the genesis of this legislation, we in government have been very clear, something that we want to do. We will be issuing guidance for consultation once we have Royal Assent. And that will be, once the Royal Assent has happened, the bill is in position, we'll have the ability to consult in the guidance that will be outlining how we will take forward the regime. We will then be consulting on the designations that we will launch. We'll have a 9-month investigation process for each designation, when we'll expect input from consumer organizations, businesses, industry representatives, and of course the companies themselves. The conduct requirements that we will impose, we would also be consulting for them. And then we'd be consulting on enforcement issues, as well as any further interventions that we needed to make. So we genuinely want to have that participative approach when we are hearing from all. And this actually links to the last point in coordination globally. I think that is absolutely key. We certainly, and our CEO and chair have been clear in Parliament in this, we do not want to diverge for the sake of diverging. Clearly, from Oliver's perspective, having a proliferation of different approaches is not good. And there shouldn't be any unnecessary, to borrow a term from the trade world, spaghetti bowl effects of overlapping regulations that are slightly different in different jurisdictions just for the sake of it. So I think it is important that we coordinate to minimize those issues, albeit we each do have our own jurisdictions and we have to come up with the best solutions for those jurisdictions. But a really good example I would point to is the work that Google and CMA are doing collectively just now on the privacy sandbox work. So this is Google's changes to third-party cookies. And we were concerned, as were others in the industry, that this could have a detrimental effect on Google's competition. And so Google and us are working together to ensure that that isn't the case, with a third-party monitor and in consultation with industry. And Google have committed that what they do with respect to our work will be rolled out globally. And we are consulting with other national competition authorities to make them aware of what's happening there as well, which I think is a fantastic example of what we can do. And that's the kind of ethos that I think we would like to continue as we move forward with these regimes. I'll stop there, but kudos to Vanessa for, I think, what was an excellent way of framing the debate.
Well, thank you all. And let's get into it a bit in terms of all of you have talked a bit about the what I might call the engagement process. So the way in which the interactions between not only the companies that might be regulated, but also other parties that might be affected by the regulation and between them and the regulator, and perhaps also with each other. So I've probably got a question for each of you, and Ewan, perhaps if I can start with you. It's likely that, at least in my sort of observation of this, that different companies will adopt different strategies. I mean, Oliver, I think, has been pretty clear about how he thinks about engagement in this process and managing, some of the issues that Google faces. but it appears, at least from the outside, that other firms might be taking slightly different approaches. How does a regulator who has to design a set of processes to deal with everybody, how do you think about that issue that different companies here may come at you in very different ways with very different approaches?
That's an excellent question, Richard, and I'm not going to pretend that it's an easy one that I've got an easy answer for. We are, as we've described, experiencing a paradigm shift in regulation. And the paradigm to date has been one of ex post enforcement, which leads naturally to large companies getting involved in a pugilistic litigation battle. And there's an interface between companies and regulators that is a buffer of lawyers. That is something that we want to change. That we want to inculcate a culture of compliance, a culture of forward-looking and joint working. I think the privacy sandbox example is a good one. Obviously, that is one that has occurred where it's been a commitment that Google has made under a Competition Act case. Compelling Google to have done that would have been a different story altogether. And ultimately, under the new bill, we will have the power to compel people to work with us. We'll be able to trial remedies and iterate them over time. I'd like to think that it's evident that we are genuine in our ethos of wanting to engage with companies to iterate, to develop things conjunctively as well as with stakeholders. And I would also hope that these companies would recognize that it is in their own interests to do so, particularly when we are given these new powers to impose conduct requirements. We want to get them right. And the best way for those companies to make sure that they are right is to engage early on in the process, openly, transparently with us and other stakeholders to make sure that nothing untoward happens. So I would like to think that incentives are aligned once the new powers have been granted by our Parliament.
Is it too early to ask you whether that's been your experience to date, or you're expecting that engagement really to start after the formal powers have been adopted?
So look, we engage with stakeholders, both the prospective SMS or strategic market status firms and stakeholders who are challenger tech, I would say dependent tech, consumer organizations, etc. So we've had pretty good engagement, but this is all within the context of a bill that is going into Parliament. Different companies have different views on that bill. We haven't got into the specifics with companies of who's going to be designated for what and what the conduct requirements are going to be. It would be inappropriate to do so at this time. It would be preempting the due process that we need to follow. So I would expect that today is not necessarily a good guide for tomorrow once the bill has been introduced. That marks a change, and I think at that point it's clearly in all of the companies' interests to engage with us, and we'll be fully willing to do so.
Thanks. Oliver, I mean, you talked very clearly about your experience, certainly with CMA and also perhaps more broadly, and I wondered whether, and your approach, I wondered, how you'd experience the other side. So do you think that, because what we're doing here is seeing regulation, if you like, this participatory approach, or however you want to label it, emerging out of competition authorities that traditionally are accustomed to engaging with parties in a rather different way. And I wondered, just on your experience, how you think that's going, whether there are still things that need to change or be improved on either side to make that process work better.
I mean, I think, look, I think there's sometimes the most banal stuff is usually the most useful. And when Vanessa and you both mentioned this question of resource, clearly that's important. When you're, I mean, I think people have perhaps a perception that within Google we have limitless resources. I can tell you, if you're trying to ask for engineering time at the moment to work with regulators and those engineers are working on AI, that is not a straightforward conversation. But I think on both sides of this, there is definitely a need to make sure that you have the right people available and engaged to have the kinds of quite technical conversations. It's not impossibly technical. Sometimes there's another myth, perhaps, that all of these things are impossible to ever understand. No, that's not the case. You can understand how search works by getting reasonable computer scientists from within Google and from outside of Google together to understand this. It's not impossible, but it does take time and it does take resource. And on my side, that means making sure that I am not working through, this is how we're now organized, I'm not working through layers of legal managers to get access to product teams. I go directly to senior vice presidents within the company to explain that I have an opportunity to talk to the CMA about this technical issue that you care a lot about. Come with me. So you try and open those channels and make sure that people have the time and capacity to engage as early as possible. And then I think on the agency side, the regulator side, we're very happy when we see teams being staffed up with, it's great to see lawyers and it's great to see economists, but these days it's even better to see computer scientists, to have people who have a behavioral UX background. Those are the kinds of people, because when you see people staffing up in those ways, I think that first of all, they start to speak a common language with the type of people that I'm trying to introduce to those conversations. But it's also very reassuring. I think you can trust more in a process like Privacy Sandbox when there are technical people discussing technical options for addressing quite difficult and complicated technical problems. So I think that's one of the places where continuing to invest is sensible for us and for the regulators. I'm very supportive of that in both cases. The other place is a bit softer, but I think it's important and it's something I focus a lot on internally, and it is about creating an ethos of trust and a willingness to take chances with new regulations and new regulatory teams. I think that you need that within Google, and you need that on the side of the agency. On my side, it means persuading people that with risk comes the opportunity to perhaps move quicker through this regulatory environment. It perhaps means that you're going to learn things about product ideas that you didn't think were possible, but are actually quite reasonable and have been sounded out with other people. And you may also gain support, because there will be, we are not, here's the big spoiler for you all, Google's compliance is not going to satisfy everyone, clearly. So in cases where that dissatisfaction is not really borne out by the facts, by the evidence, and that does happen from time to time, then the trust in the process, the trust in the regulator, the trust in those technical teams can sometimes mean that you can rely on those people to support you, to say, well, no, this complaint, no, this is not. Google's done its best. This is not what the law is designed to do. And I'm afraid this is not the right piece of legislation for you to use if you have an issue. There may be some other rule that you can rely on, or perhaps this is a commercial dispute you need to figure out with Google. So I think those are the two places for me, Richard. I think there's the day-to-day of investment in the people, the right people, getting them in the room for both sides of these debates, but also trying to create that environment of trust on my side. And of course, what you see delivered from some of these conversations from Sandbox and all of the children of Sandbox, if you like, that will be how we demonstrate that the trust has been worthwhile, that the trade-offs have made sense.
Thanks. Just one other question. A participatory model that takes in the views, seeks to capture the views of everybody and everybody's in the process might raise concerns that it just takes longer, it's slower. And you made the point, I think, that this market's moving very fast, and one of the motivations for this regulatory framework is that previous attempts to deal with those issues proved too slow. And is there a trade-off between sort of participation and agility?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. It's something that is very much front of mind for us. I take Vanessa's points earlier on, the importance of ensuring that there are litigation opportunities. And I think that's a very valid point. I think perhaps not without any constraints or filters, because the more people who are involved in the enforcement of the DMA, for example, the more we will see of that kind of stuff, and the more you tilt into that litigious world, I think, which is unhelpful. That being said, of course, you can't negotiate a solution for a consumer-facing, very significant product like search without hearing the views of consumers who are going to be using search. Of course, you need to have, those voices need to have they need to have a seat at the table from the very beginning of any of the kinds of solutions that you might conceive of there. So look, I've been thinking about it a lot. I tend to think that if you accept that you can't have everyone in the room, but it also can't be a private bilateral. In between, there are probably opportunities for a greater transparency about the nature of the problem that you're trying to address, greater transparency about the nature of the evidence that you're relying on to pursue a particular solution, and a willingness to not close the door on iteration. Right? At Google, whenever we launch products, quite apart from regulatory solutions, we think about launch and iterate, launch and iterate. What's the feedback? What are the metrics showing? And I think that can absolutely work. It's probably the most appropriate framework for thinking about regulatory design, and you're having these kinds of engagements, so that if Vanessa has a new body of evidence that we haven't considered 6 months into a remedy that's just been launched, well, why would you not kind of think and be flexible and accept that you don't have to get it all right immediately? So I think with those kinds of safeguards, you can probably strike a bit of a balance. I mean, there will always be someone outside the room who wishes they were in, and there may be someone is in the room who shouldn't be there, and you'll have to deal with that a little bit. But hopefully with that transparency, you can reassure a lot of people that if they weren't there, then the right things were being done.
Yeah, yeah. Vanessa, perhaps we can come back to you. I mean, what you made a very powerful case for making sure that particularly the consumer voices in the room, from the outset, and I wondered. I mean, there are two models for that potentially. One is that the regulator convenes parties in a room and there's discussion with the regulator in the room. But the other is that the regulated firms have a dialogue themselves directly with consumers or with consumer representatives, before anything even gets in front of the regulator, if you like. And I wondered just whether you'd thought about that, what your expectations are, around what it is the firms themselves will do, as opposed to perhaps what you expect the regulators to do.
Thanks. I think that's a really interesting question. But maybe before I turn to that, just wanted to pick up on some of the things that you and Ollie said, which I very much welcome. It's very good to hear that there is no intention to go into a long, drawn-out litigation process on these issues. And you, Richard, mentioned whether participatory approach might actually be too slow. I think it can also be quicker, because we know on certain issues that litigation can go on for years and years and years. I think Ollie and I can think of a case which has gone on for more than 10 years. So that's not an ideal situation in a fast-moving market. So in that sense, dialogue, I think, to come back to your question, is a really important approach to try. And I agree that litigation also from the consumer perspective is not the ideal way. So I think one would only use that if one can't sort things out in discussion, for the same reason that I mentioned before about the length of time of that. But it needs to be a backstop for consumers to have that option if things are not going as they should. But then on whether it makes sense to talk bilaterally to regulators or to companies directly, I think I have a kind of open mind on that. Let's test it out and see what happens. And I think it will also partly depend on a point that Ewan made, and that is like the mindset of platforms. I mean, is there a willingness, as Ollie said, to really engage and to look at what other parties can bring by way of evidence? And is there a kind of genuine engage to comply not only with say, I mean, to use a not very scientifically termed, the letter of the law, or to engage with what the law is actually trying to achieve? And in that regard, one of the things I think is going to be very important, and actually Ollie touched on it as well, that's the issue of how the regulation also deals with behavioral aspects or UX design aspects. I mean, is there a willingness to recognize that platforms should not be trying to circumvent the obligations under whichever regime through the use of kind of user interface design, online choice architecture to circumvent the rights that are given to consumers on that. I mean, if there is a willingness to engage, I think consumers, I mean, just speaking personally, I think then consumers would be very happy to engage to get the right results that works to everyone's advantage.
I mean, I suppose let me see what you think of this. There's potentially a benefit in encouraging platforms to proactively consult, you know, very early on in the process with consumer interests and other affected parties, in a sense, to anticipate problems that might otherwise have to get fixed later on downstream in the regulatory process itself. So I just wonder whether there might be an efficiency gain as well if consumers were brought in early. But then there's obviously the question of how do you have any thoughts on how would that be BEOC and the consumer organizations, or is there some other way in which you think the consumer voice should be brought in? Surveys, or I don't know. Any thoughts on how practically is that view fed into the process?
Also an interesting question. I mean, I can only really speak for BEOC, and certainly we're always open to listen to what companies have to say, whichever whether they're business users of platforms or platforms themselves, and to engage in that way. Surveys might be an interesting way to go, but I think it depends on how you do the survey. I mean, surveys can be done in a good way and they can be done in a less good way. So I think that has to be seen cautiously. I can't speak for other consumer organizations, but perhaps, you know, broadening it out beyond consumers, other civil society organizations are also interested in this debate. Digital rights organizations, for example, freedom of speech organizations, and the like. And I think they may have a point of view to bring as well on some of the issues that are at play here. I mean, particularly sort of in the data protection type sphere, but not only.
We don't have a huge amount of time left. We've got a few more minutes. I mean, what I think would be helpful from each of you, perhaps if we start with Ewan and then Oliver and then you Vanessa, is, and then I have to ask you the question at the end about the future of platforms being ... But it is, you know, just from where your vantage point at the moment, because each of you are in different, clearly at different points in this on the compass. You know, what is your what do you see as the biggest challenge at the moment? What is the aspect of moving from where we are today to where we're going to be in 5 years' time? What is the issue that is most preoccupying you and most concerning you? I mean, getting some legislation, Ewan, I guess, is obviously sort of step one on that. But assuming that happens, what do you anticipate being? Is it getting resources? You know, getting the right data scientists? Is it? Any thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. So yes, I was absolutely going to say that getting legislation through would be my biggest concern at the minute. I think it is important to reflect on the data scientists' point. So it's something that Oliver raised as well. So in the CMA, we have a data analytics, data technology and analytics unit that services different teams across the CMA, in particular the digital markets unit. And therein we have behavioral scientists, we have computer scientists, we have data scientists. And I should mention as well that I'm in a job share, and I'm an economist, sorry, but my job share partner is a behavioral scientist. And so that's something that we are taking very seriously, is incorporating that skill set into the organization. Now, we're not the only ones hiring in this space, and I'm pretty sure that Oliver's hiring some of those people as well. So we might be competing in the same field. So I think probably collectively we want there to be more resources to facilitate this exchange between industry and government. So I think that is a fair challenge. The thing that will immediately be in my attention once we get to royal assent is going out to consultation on the guidance, and really getting industry views and how we shape the actual practical implementation of the regime. And things such as you were mentioning there, of is it surveys? Do we have particular groupings, roundtables? We need to figure that out, and it's probably no one size fits all model, but it's something that we'll want to hear about that from industry and stakeholders themselves, about how would they like to best engage with the regime so that we can make this a reality. So lots of that.
And if you think yourself forward and sort of, you know, think about what the future of platform regulation will be in 5 years' time in a sentence, do you have a vision?
A constructive, healthy relationship with governments.
Thanks. Oliver.
So the challenge, so the thing that I personally, I can't speak for the rest of Google, maybe one or two of my team, but I think a lot about is, as we take a sort of breath and jump off the diving board and take the approach that we're taking at Google to regulatory compliance, which is to be fast and engaged and see opportunities to innovate within that framework. That's very much the ethos at Google. I think there are probably three things that I'm hoping to see come back in the other direction from the regulators that we're working with. First of all, clarity. They get some courage to be able to give us clarity and give us clear direction. It's very easy to listen to Google and say, oh yes, perhaps this, perhaps that, or we'll talk to the market. I think clarity and being prepared, all the caveats will attach, but clarity in how the rules ought to apply to us, that's something I hope for and will help us accelerate, I think. Equanimity in the ways in which they look at what we are saying and what complainants are saying and what third parties are saying, and that kind of detachment that you hope for in a regulator who's not going to be buffeted by, you know, political goals or influential complainants, but will give us that feedback on the merits, whether we like it or not. I think we strive for that. And parity, you know, I think that is something that's been, you've touched on this, I think one of your questions, Richard. If we get to a point in this process where we see that the alternative, let's say, approach of holding back, resisting, keeping information on your side of the fence, litigating procedural points, if that approach allows you to continue to maintain a particular approach that we think is less open than ours, then that becomes difficult, clearly, for an in-house team. Well, it's much better their way, Ollie, is what will happen. So I hope that in the combination of clarity, equanimity, and parity, that's how I can show to people that it's worthwhile to participate.
Thanks, very clear. And you know, you're in a sentence, the regulation 5 years, or platform regulation 5 years from now.
I mean, I think, it's very, yes, it's always, it's tough, but it's fun. Look, I think that compliance, regulatory, 5 years from now, I think for Google, that it is still an opportunity to innovate. It's innovation in compliance. I think that for us is what we hope for. It doesn't have to be a thicket of restrictions and constraints. It can be an opportunity to move fast and to innovate if you understand the rules better than your competitor. Right? I mean, that's the goal.
Super. Vanessa, you get the last word.
Thank you. In terms of what I would like to kind of see coming up would be good consumer-focused regulation, not just DMA, DSA, but also Data Act, and to pick up on the first speaker, also in relation to AI, where I think that is also going to raise some interesting questions and therefore needs to be brought into the picture in a future-proof ways. Secondly, I think coming back to my original point, making sure that this regulation actually works for consumers to generate more innovation and choice. And then if I fast forward to in 5 years' time, to answer your second question, I think I hope the same as Ewan. And I would add one other thing to that. I hope that regulation will still be up to date then, and if not, that it has been updated, so that we can continue to benefit from innovation, whether it's from bigger tech companies or smaller ones.
Terrific. Well, thank you to all our panelists. Very interesting session. I think just remains for me to hand back to Laura.
Thank you very much, Richard. And thank you to Oliver, Vanessa, and Ewan for this discussion on this very important topic.